The vultures had been circling for 2 days now, their shadows dancing across Quinlan's cracked lips like harbingers of death. His stomach gnawed at itself with a hunger, so fierce it felt like a wild animal clawing to escape his ribs. The last drops of water from his canteen had been gone since sunrise, and the merciless Arizona sun beat down on him and his faithful mare, Copper. With the fury of a blacksmith's forge, Quinlan Mackenzie had been riding hard for 6 days straight, ever since the Pinkerton detectives had cornered him in Tombstone. The evidence they'd planted was convincing enough, forged papers showing he'd rustled cattle from the Morrison Ranch, but Quinlan knew the truth. His own brother, Waylon, had set him up to steal the family inheritance their dying father had promised to split between them. Now, slumped forward in his saddle like a scarecrow stuffed with straw, Quinlan could barely keep his eyes open. His vision blurred and swam, the endless expanse of desert rock and sagebrush melting together like watercolors in the rain. Copper beneath him moved with the steady determination of a creature who understood that stopping meant death for them both. Just a little further, girl, he whispered, his voice nothing more than sandpaper against wood. We'll find water soon. But even as he spoke the words, Quinlan felt the lie burning in his throat. They were deep in the Sonoran wilderness now, miles from any known settlement. The few Indian trails they'd crossed had led nowhere, vanishing into rocky arroyos and dead-end canyons. His compass spun uselessly, either broken or confused by some strange magnetic phenomenon. In these desolate hills, Copper's ears suddenly pricked forward, and she lifted her great head with renewed interest. Her nostrils flared wide, testing the air for something Quinlan's dulled senses couldn't detect. Then she did something that nearly unseated her weakened rider. She veered sharply to the left, abandoning the game trail they'd been following. "Ho, girl," Quinlan mumbled, trying to pull on the reins, but his grip was too weak, and Copper had made up her mind. She picked up her pace, moving with purpose through a narrow gap between the towering red sandstone formations. The change in terrain was immediate. Where before there had been nothing but scattered creosote bushes and prickly pear cactus, now Quinlan noticed patches of buffalo grass and even a few stunted oak trees. Clinging to the rocky slopes, the air felt different, too cooler somehow, though the sun still blazed overhead. Copper's hooves clicked against exposed bedrock as she climbed steadily upward, through what appeared to be a hidden canyon. The walls rose higher on either side, providing blessed shade for the first time in days. Quinlan's fevered mind began to play tricks on him. He thought he could smell wood smoke, then bacon frying. His stomach cramped so violently he nearly doubled over. Just my imagination, he gasped. But Copper's pace quickened to a trot, then a canter. She whinnied a sound full of excitement and hope. And then, as they rounded a bend in the narrow canyon, Quinlan saw something that made him wonder if he'd finally succumbed to the desert madness that claimed so many travelers. There, nestled against the canyon wall like a jewel hidden in a rock crevice, stood a small log cabin. Quinlan blinked hard, certain the cabin would vanish like every other mirage that had tormented him over the past 6 days, but it remained stubbornly. Real rough-hewn logs chinked with adobe mud, a stone chimney sending up a thin ribbon of smoke, and windows that gleamed like amber in the afternoon light. A small corral to one side held 3 horses, their coats sleek and well-fed. Copper had stopped at the edge of a tiny creek that bubbled up from somewhere deep in the rocks and meandered past the cabin before disappearing again into the earth. Without waiting for permission, she plunged her muzzle into the clear water and drank deeply. The sound of her drinking seemed to echo off the canyon walls like thunder. Quinlan tried to dismount, but found his legs wouldn't support him. He slid from the saddle and collapsed beside the creek, plunging his face into the blessed coolness. The water tasted like liquid diamonds, sweet and pure beyond anything he'd ever experienced. He drank until his stomach ached, then splashed the precious liquid over his sunburned face and neck. "Easy there, son. Too much too fast will make you sick." The voice came from behind him. Calm and measured, Quinlan spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the cold .45 at his hip. But his movements were clumsy with exhaustion, and before he could draw, he found himself looking up at a man who seemed to have materialized from the canyon walls themselves. The stranger was perhaps 60 years old, with silver-streaked hair and eyes the color of winter sky. He wore simple clothes, denim pants, a cotton shirt, and boots that had seen hard use, but were well-maintained. Most remarkably, he showed no surprise at finding a half-dead cowboy, collapsed beside his creek. "Name's Cornelius Brewster," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "Been expecting you." Quinlan's fevered mind struggled to process this statement. "Expecting me? Your horse knew the way," Cornelius said simply. He walked over to Copper, who had finished drinking and was now cropping grass that grew in impossible green abundance. Around the creek banks, the mare allowed him to stroke her neck as if they were old friends. Copper's got more sense than most humans when it comes to finding sanctuary. "How do you know her name?" Quinlan's voice was barely a croak. Cornelius smiled, an expression that seemed to hold secrets older than the canyon walls. "Same way I know yours, Quinlan Mackenzie. Same way I know you've been riding hard from trouble that ain't of your own making." The world tilted sideways, and Quinlan felt consciousness slipping away like water through his fingers. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was something that made no sense at all carved into the wooden door of the cabin, in letters that looked like they'd been burned there by a branding iron was a single word. Pahen. Quinlan woke. He was lying on a comfortable bed inside the cabin, covered by a quilt that smelled of sage and wood smoke. Sunlight streamed through the windows, but it was the gentle light of evening rather than the harsh glare of midday. A pot bubbled over the fire, filling the single room with the aroma of beef stew that made his mouth water uncontrollably. Cornelius sat in a rocking chair beside the hearth, whittling a piece of pine. He looked up as Quinlan stirred. "Feeling better?" he asked. Quinlan sat up slowly, testing his strength. The crushing weakness was gone, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue that felt almost luxurious after days of suffering. "How long was I out?" "Rest of yesterday. All night. Most of today." "Your body needed the healing sleep." Cornelius set down his whittling and moved to the pot. "Hungry?" The question was almost cruel in its obviousness. Quinlan's stomach responded with a growl that would have shamed a grizzly bear. Cornelius chuckled and ladled thick stew into a wooden bowl, along with a chunk of fresh bread that looked like it had just come from an oven. As Quinlan ate, trying to pace himself despite his body's demands, he studied his rescuer more carefully. There was something otherworldly about Cornelius Brewster, something that went beyond his uncanny knowledge of Quinlan's name and circumstances. The man moved with a grace that seemed to belong to a much younger person, and his eyes held depths that suggested he'd seen more of life than any single person should. "That word on your door," Quinlan said between spoonfuls of the best stew he'd ever tasted. "Pa, what does it mean?" Cornelius's expression grew thoughtful. "Depends on who's asking. To some folks, it might mean father. To others, it might mean peace or protection or place of refuge. What does it mean to you?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from the cabin's chimney. Quinlan set down his spoon, the weight of the past 6 days suddenly pressing against his chest like a physical thing. When he spoke, his voice carried the bitterness of betrayal and the ache of loss. "My pa died 3 months ago," he said. "Cancer ate him up from the inside, but he fought it to the very end. Always said the Mackenzie ranch would go to both his boys, me and my brother Waylon." Quinlan's hands clenched into fists, but Waylon got greedy. Soon as Pa was in the ground, he started working with some crooked lawyers and Pinkerton agents to frame me for cattle rustling. Figured if I was in prison or on the run, he'd inherit everything. Cornelius listened without interruption, his weathered face showing neither judgment nor surprise. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. "Pa always said family was the most important thing in the world," Quinlan continued, his voice growing thick with emotion. "Said blood was thicker than water, and that brothers should stand by each other no matter what. I believed him, right up until Waylon planted those forged bills of sale in my saddlebags and tipped off the law. And now you're running." Cornelius observed quietly. "What choice do I have? I can't prove my innocence from inside a jail cell. And Waylon's got half the territory believing I'm a common thief." Quinlan gestured toward the door. "That word on your cabin, Pa, it's like Sultan. A wound. Reminds me of everything I've lost. Cornelius stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, he withdrew a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. Your pa wasn't the only father who had trouble with his sons, he said, settling back into his chair. Mind if I tell you a story? Without waiting for an answer, Cornelius opened the book, but he didn't read from it instead. He seemed to use it as a prompt for memories that lived somewhere deeper than written words. There was once a man named Moses Brewster, he began. Had a spread down in Texas before the war. Built it up from nothing with his own two hands and the help of his eldest son, a boy named Jacob. Smart as a whip, Jacob was, and loyal as the day is long. Moses planned to leave him the whole ranch when the time came. Quinlan found himself drawn into the story despite his exhaustion. But Moses had another son, too, younger boy named Benjamin. Ben was always jealous of the attention Jacob got, always. Feeling like he was second best, when Moses got sick with lung fever, Ben saw his chance. He forged his father's will, bribed a judge, and had Jacob framed for horse theft. The parallels were so obvious that Quinlan felt his breath catch. What happened to Jacob? He ran. Cornelius said simply. Ran for months through some of the harshest country God ever made. Lost everything, his home, his good name, his faith and family. The old man's eyes grew distant. But sometimes when a man's lost everything, that's when he finds what really matters, which is that blood might be thicker than water, but love is thicker than blood. And sometimes the family that matters most isn't the one you're born into, it's the one you choose. Cornelius closed the book and leaned forward in his chair. Jacob eventually found proof of his brother's treachery, cleared his name, got his inheritance back, but by then, he'd learned something more valuable than any ranch or pile of gold. What's that? That forgiveness isn't about forgetting what someone did to you. It's about refusing to let their actions poison your own heart. Cornelius's eyes seemed to look right through Quinlan. Jacob forgave his brother Benjamin. Not because Ben deserved it, but because Jacob deserved to be free of the anger that was eating him alive. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, Quinlan could hear Copper moving contentedly in the corral, safe and well-fed for the first time in days. That's a nice story, Quinlan said finally. But it doesn't change my situation. I'm still wanted for crimes I didn't commit, and my brother's still sleeping in the house that should be half mine. Cornelius smiled the same mysterious expression he'd worn when Quinlan first laid eyes on him. Maybe not, but morning has a way of bringing new possibilities. Why don't you get some more rest? Tomorrow, we'll see about setting some things right. As if summoned by his words, exhaustion crashed over Quinlan like a wave. His eyelids grew heavy, and the warmth of the cabin seemed to wrap around him like a protective cocoon. The last thing he heard before sleep claimed him was Cornelius's voice, soft as a lullaby. Sometimes, son, when you think you're running away from something, you're actually running toward exactly where you need to be. Dawn arrived like a whispered promise, filtering through the cabin windows in shafts of gold and amber. Quinlan woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, his body feeling stronger than it had in weeks. The bone-deep exhaustion that had plagued him for days was gone, replaced by a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced since before his father's death. Cornelius stood at the stove, tending to breakfast with the easy movements of a man accustomed to solitude. He glanced over as Quinlan stirred. Sleep well, he asked. Better than I have in months. Quinlan sat up, running his hands through his hair. I had the strangest dreams, though. Dreams about my pa, about things he said before he died. Dreams have a way of telling us truths we're not ready to hear when we're awake, Cornelius observed, setting a plate of eggs and bacon on the rough wooden table. What did your pa tell you in these dreams? Quinlan accepted the offered breakfast gratefully, but found himself hesitating before answering. The dreams had been vivid, beyond anything he'd ever experienced, so real he could still smell his father's pipe tobacco and hear the wheeze in his voice from the cancer that had consumed his lungs. He told me he was proud of me, Quinlan said. Finally, said I was the son who reminded him of himself when he was young. But then he paused, struggling with the memory. Then he said something that didn't make sense. He said the most important inheritance he could give me wasn't land or cattle or money. What was it? The knowledge of who I really am. Quinlan looked up from his plate, said that could never be stolen, forged, or taken away by any man, even a brother. Cornelius nodded slowly, as if this revelation didn't surprise him in the least. Wise man, your father. Sounds like he understood something most folks never learn, which is that a man's true worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he does when everything he owns is stripped away. Cornelius poured himself a cup of coffee and settled into his chair. You've been running for 6 days, Quinlan. But what have you learned about yourself in that time? The question caught Quinlan off guard. He'd been so focused on survival, on staying ahead of the law and his brother's treachery, that he hadn't stopped to consider what the ordeal might have taught him. I learned I'm stronger than I thought, he said slowly, and that copper here is the most loyal friend a man could ask for. He glanced toward the door, where he could see his mare grazing peacefully in the corral. I learned that when everything else falls away, sometimes all you have left is your word and your character, and maybe that's enough. Cornelius smiled, the first genuine, uncomplicated smile Quinlan had seen from him. Your pa would be proud to hear you say that. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the morning light growing stronger and warming the cabin's interior. Finally, Cornelius reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. This came yesterday evening, he said, setting it on the table between them. Ryder brought it up from Tucson. Quinlan stared at the paper as if it might bite him. What is it? News, the kind that changes things. With trembling fingers, Quinlan unfolded the paper. It was a telegram, and as he read the words, his world shifted on its axis. Waylon Mackenzie arrested. Stop. Forged documents discovered. Stop. Confession obtained. Stop. Quinlan Mackenzie cleared all charges. Stop. Return home immediately. Stop. Paper slipped from Quinlan's numb fingers and fluttered to the floor. How is this possible? I've been running for 6 days. This telegram is dated yesterday. Sometimes justice moves in mysterious ways, Cornelius said quietly. Your brother's greed got the better of him. He tried to sell some of those forged documents to another rancher, but the buyer got suspicious and took them to the territorial marshal. Didn't take long for the whole scheme to unravel once they started looking into it. Quinlan felt tears prick at his eyes, tears of relief, vindication, and something deeper. For the first time since his father's death, he felt truly free. I can go home, he whispered. You can, Cornelius agreed. Question is, what kind of man will you be when you get there? Quinlan looked up sharply. What do you mean? Your brother betrayed you in the worst possible way, cost you weeks of suffering, nearly cost you your life. The law will punish him, but that doesn't erase what he did. Cornelius's eyes were steady and grave. You've got a choice to make, son. You can let that betrayal turn you bitter and hard, or you can choose to be the bigger man. You think I should forgive him after what he put me through. I think you should consider what your pa would want you to do, and more importantly, what kind of man you want to be for the rest of your life. The sun was climbing toward its zenith when Quinlan finally saddled Copper for the journey home. The mare seemed to sense the change in their fortunes. Her ears were pricked forward with interest, and she pranced slightly as he tightened the cinch, eager to be moving again. Cornelius had provided him with supplies for the 3-day ride. Back to the Mackenzie ranch, jerky, hardtack, a full canteen, and even a small bag of grain for Copper. More importantly, he'd given Quinlan something to think about during the long miles ahead. Remember what I told you about forgiveness, the old man said as Quinlan prepared to mount up. It's not about letting your brother off the hook for what he did. It's about refusing to carry the poison of hatred in your own heart. I understand the words, Quinlan replied, settling into his saddle. But understanding and doing are two different things. True enough, but you'll have plenty of time to work it out on the ride home. Cornelius handed him the reins, then looked up with those penetrating winter blue eyes. One more thing, son, when you get back to your ranch, take a good look around, really see it. Your pa built something more than just a spread there. He built a legacy. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Quinlan touched the brim of his hat in farewell. I reckon I'll figure that out when I get there. "Thank you, Cornelius, for everything. I don't know how you knew I'd be coming, or how you happened to have that telegram. But some things don't need explaining," Cornelius interrupted gently. "They just need accepting. Safe travels, Quinlan Mackenzie, and remember the door marked. Pa isn't just on my cabin. It's carved into every choice you make from here on out." With that cryptic farewell ringing in his ears, Quinlan urged Copper into motion. The mare stepped out eagerly, following the hidden trail that would take them out of the canyon and back into the wider world. When Quinlan looked back one last time, he saw Cornelius standing in front of his cabin, one hand raised in goodbye. Then the canyon walls closed behind them, and the mysterious refuge was gone as if it had never existed. The first day's ride passed in a blur of high desert and scattered mesas. Quinlan found his mind wandering over everything that had happened: his father's death, Waylon's betrayal, the desperate flight into the wilderness, and the impossible sanctuary where Copper had led him. Most of all, he thought about Cornelius's words regarding forgiveness and legacy. By evening, when he made camp beside a small spring, Quinlan had begun to see his situation from a different perspective. Yes, Waylon had betrayed him terribly, but his brother was also a man eaten alive by jealousy and greed, emotions that had ultimately destroyed him just as surely as they'd nearly destroyed Quinlan. In a strange way, Waylon was as much a victim of his own choices as Quinlan had been. The second day brought him into more familiar territory. He passed landmarks he'd known since childhood: the Twisted Oak, where he and Waylon had built a tree fort, the creek where they'd learned to fish, the hill where their father had taught them both to ride. Each memory was bittersweet, tinged with the knowledge of how far apart the two brothers had grown. That night, camped within a day's ride of home, Quinlan made his decision. He would forgive Waylon not because his brother deserved it, but because Cornelius had been right about the poison of hatred. More importantly, he would use his inheritance not just to rebuild the ranch, but to create something that would honor their father's memory and perhaps, in time, heal the rift between the Mackenzie brothers. The third day dawned clear and bright, with a crisp autumn edge to the air that spoke of winter's approach. As Copper topped the final ridge before home, Quinlan saw the Mackenzie ranch spread out below him like something from a dream. The house his father had built with his own hands, the barns and corrals where Quinlan had learned the cowboy trade, the rolling pastures where Mackenzie cattle had grazed for 20 years. It was all still there, waiting for him. But as he rode down the familiar track toward the ranch buildings, Quinlan noticed something that made him pull up short. There, sitting on the front porch of the ranch house, was a figure he recognized even at a distance. Waylon sat slumped forward, his head in his hands, the very picture of a man who had lost everything that mattered. Quinlan sat motionless in his saddle for a long moment, studying his brother from across the ranch yard. Waylon looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. His clothes were rumpled and dirty, his hair unkempt, and even from a distance, Quinlan could see the defeated slump of his shoulders. This wasn't the confident, scheming man who had orchestrated his betrayal. This was a broken human being facing the consequences of his choices. Copper stamped impatiently, eager for her stall and a good meal. The sound carried across the yard, and Waylon's head snapped up. For several heartbeats, the two brothers stared at each other across the space that had once been filled with shared childhood memories, but was now a chasm of betrayal and pain. Finally, Quinlan urged Copper forward. He rode slowly, deliberately, giving himself time to process the emotions warring in his chest. Anger was there, certainly a deep, burning resentment at what Waylon had put him through. But there was something else too, something that surprised him with its strength: pity. He dismounted 20 feet from the porch and stood facing his brother. Waylon had risen to his feet, but he didn't come down the steps. Instead, he stood there like a man waiting for judgment, his face a mask of shame and regret. "Hello, Waylon," Quinlan said quietly. Quinlan. His brother's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. I thought you were dead when you didn't come back after the first few days. I thought," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "I nearly was." Quinlan replied truthfully. "Spent 6 days in the desert with no food and barely any water. If it hadn't been for Copper here, and a miracle I'm still trying to understand. I would have died out there. Waylon flinched as if he'd been struck. Quinlan, why? The question came out harder than Quinlan had intended. Pa left us both. The ranch, we could have worked it together, been partners like he always wanted. Why wasn't that enough for you? Waylon's face crumpled. He sank back down onto the porch steps, covering his face with his hands. Because I was never as good as you, he said, his voice muffled. Pa tried to hide it, but I could see it in his eyes. You were the one he was proud of. You were the one who reminded him of himself. I was just the other son. That's not true. It is true. Waylon looked up, his eyes red with unshed tears. You were better at everything: writing, roping, reading the land, working with the men. Pa knew it. I knew it. Everybody knew it. I thought if I could just have the ranch to myself, I could prove I was worth something too. Quinlan stared at his brother, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. All those childhood rivalries, all the competitions and comparisons they'd been eating at Waylon like a cancer, just as surely as the disease that had killed their father. You were always worth something, Quinlan said finally. Pa loved you, just as much as he loved me. He told me so, right before he died. Then why didn't he say it to me? Waylon's voice broke on the words. Maybe he did, and you weren't ready to hear it. Or maybe he thought you already knew. Quinlan took a step closer. Either way, it doesn't matter now. What matters is where we go from here. Waylon stared at him in confusion. What do you mean? I destroyed everything. I betrayed you, lied about you, nearly got you killed. The sheriff says I'll probably do 5 years in territorial prison. There's nowhere we go from here. Quinlan was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything Cornelius had told him, about forgiveness and legacy, and the kind of man he wanted to be. When he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. I'm not pressing charges, he said. Waylon's mouth fell open. What? You heard me. I'm going to tell the sheriff I don't want to prosecute. The forged documents are evidence enough of what happened. But without my testimony, they won't have much of a case. But why? After everything I did to you? Quinlan looked around the ranch at the house their father had built, the land he'd loved, the legacy he'd wanted to leave his sons. Then he looked back at his brother, seeing not the man who had betrayed him, but the boy he'd grown up with, played with, shared dreams with. Because you're my brother, he said simply. And because Pa wouldn't want his ranch to be the thing that destroyed his family forever. Waylon began to cry, then deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere far below his ribs. Quinlan climbed the porch steps and sat down beside his brother, not saying anything, just being present while years of jealousy and guilt poured out of the man who had nearly destroyed them both. When the tears finally stopped, Waylon wiped his face with his sleeve and looked at Quinlan with something approaching wonder. I don't deserve this, he said. No, Quinlan agreed. But forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to be better than the worst thing someone's done to you. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon. Finally, Waylon spoke again. What happens now? I mean, even if you don't press charges, I can't stay here. Not after what I did. The shame of it, maybe, Quinlan said thoughtfully. Or maybe this is where you learn to live with the shame and do better. Pa always said this ranch was big enough for both of us. Maybe it's time we found out if he was right. 6 months later, Quinlan stood on the same porch where he'd confronted his brother, watching the sun rise over Mackenzie land. The ranch looked different now, better somehow, as if it had been waiting for both brothers to finally understand what their father had always known. The changes were visible everywhere. New corrals had been built to handle the expanded herd. The barn had been repaired and enlarged. Fresh paint gleamed on the house and outbuildings. But the most important changes weren't the ones you could see with your eyes. Waylon emerged from the barn, leading a young colt that danced and pranced at the end of his lead rope. Over the past months, Quinlan's brother had discovered a gift for training horses that none of them had suspected he possessed. His patience and gentleness with the animals seemed to come from the same deep well of remorse that had nearly destroyed him, transformed now into something constructive and healing. Morning, Waylon called. his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. "Storm here is ready for his first ride. Want to do the honors?" Quinlan grinned and vaulted over the porch railing, a move that would have been impossible during those dark days in the desert. "Storm, is it? Let me guess he's got a temperament to match the name. Actually, he's gentle as a lamb." I named him Storm because that's what his birth felt like, the storm that cleared the air and made everything clean again. The metaphor wasn't lost on Quinlan. The brothers had weathered their own storm over the past months, learning to work together, to trust each other, and perhaps most importantly, to forgive themselves for the years they'd wasted on jealousy and competition. As Quinlan saddled the young horse, his thoughts drifted to that mysterious canyon and the man who had saved his life. In more ways than one, he'd tried to find Cornelius Brewster several times, riding back into the desert with supplies and gifts, wanting to thank him properly. But the canyon had never appeared again, no matter how carefully he retraced Copper's route. It was as if the whole experience had been a dream except for the very real changes it had wrought in his heart. "You're thinking about that man in the canyon again," Waylon observed, watching his brother's distant expression. "How did you know? You get that look sometimes, like you're trying to solve a puzzle that doesn't have all its pieces." Waylon adjusted Storm's bridle with practiced hands. "You ever figure out who he really was?" Quinlan considered the question as he checked the cinch. Over the months, he'd developed his own theory about Cornelius Brewster, though it was one he'd never shared with anyone. "I think," he said slowly, "that he was exactly who I needed him to be. Exactly when I needed him to be it." "That's not really an answer. Maybe it's the only answer that matters." Storm accepted his first rider with the calm dignity of a horse that had been handled with love and patience from birth. As Quinlan guided him around the corral in easy circles, he reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day when he'd fled into the desert. The Mackenzie ranch was prospering again, but more than that, it had become what their father had always envisioned, a true partnership between brothers who complemented each other's strengths rather than competing over their differences. Quinlan handled the cattle operation and the business side of things, while Waylon had developed the horse breeding program into something that was becoming famous throughout the territory. But perhaps the most important change was in the brothers themselves. The bitter rivalry that had poisoned their relationship for years had been replaced by mutual respect and genuine affection. They had learned, through trial and fire, that love was indeed thicker than blood, and that forgiveness was the most powerful force in the human heart. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber, a familiar figure caught Quinlan's eye. Copper stood at the fence, her intelligent eyes fixed on her rider. She had become something of a legend on the ranch, the horse who had somehow known exactly where to go when all hope seemed lost. Quinlan dismounted and walked over to her, stroking her neck affectionately. "You know something the rest of us don't you, girl?" he murmured. Copper nickered softly and nuzzled his shoulder, as if to say that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. That evening, as the brothers sat on the porch sharing a drink and watching the stars emerge in the desert sky, Waylon raised his glass in a toast. "To Pa," he said simply. "To Pa," Quinlan agreed, touching his glass to his brothers, "and to second chances, and to horses that know the way home even when we don't." They drank in comfortable silence, two men who had found their way back to each other through the vast wilderness of pride and pain. In the distance, coyotes called to the moon, and somewhere in the darkness, Copper